everyone, and welcome to the Jeff Buller Show. Today I have with me Nick Bostrom. Now, I've been wanting to talk to Nick for quite a while. I read his book, Superintelligence, about 5 or 6 years ago, and he's just released a new book called Deep Utopia. And I'm really looking forward to having a chat with Nick. A little bit more about Nick. He's a professor at Oxford University, where he's founding director of the Future of Humanity Institute. Nick is the world's most cited philosopher aged 50 or under. He's the author of more than 200 publications, including Anthropic Bias, Global Catastrophic Risks, Human Enhancement, and Superintelligence, Paths, Dangers, Strategies, which was a New York Times bestseller. And it sparked a lot of conversation about the future of AI. His work has been pioneered many ideas that frame current thinking about humanity's future, such as the concept of existential risk, the simulation argument, the wrong of the world hypothesis, and unilateralist curse, which, while some of his recent work concerns the moral status of digital minds. His writings have been translated in more than 30 languages, is a repeat main stage TED speaker. He has been interviewed more than 1,000 times by media around the world. He has been, and it keeps going, he has been on Foreign Policy's top 100 global thinkers list twice and was included in Prospect World Thinkers list, the youngest person in the top 15. He has an academic background in theoretical physics, AI, and computational neuroscience, as well as philosophy. He has just published a new book, Deep Utopia, Life and Meaning in a Solved World. Nick, welcome to the show. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here. And thank you for coming along. It's been great to have you here.
Yeah, no, thanks I look forward to talking with you, Jeff.
Great. Now, Nick's dialing in from Portugal, where he's trying to get some seclusion. And we all like that. I'm in New York, because I'm on the road a little bit, which is the opposite of seclusion. It's just New York is this crazy big city that is full of interesting, divergent people and ideas and minds. And it's so Nick's in seclusion. I'm actually in the middle of chaos. So, Nick, I have so many questions I want to ask you. And I suppose, firstly, I want to know a little bit. You've got a whole range of things you do. You're into economics, physics, neuroscience, AI, and philosophy. Okay. And I'm sure there's other topics around that subtext as well. So, and you've written 2 books, though, on AI. That's what I find interesting as well. So what led you, because you are Swedish born, I think you did your first degree, was it in Sweden, was it?
Yep.
So what was that first degree, and where did that come from? In other words, there was a curiosity about something that called you to do that degree. And then I want to talk a little bit about where you moved on from there. So what was your first degree and curiosity that led you into the academic field?
It was actually a mixed. One of the good things about the Swedish university system, at least back then, was that you had, as an undergraduate, a lot of freedom to compose your own curriculum. You could sort of pick and choose.
Okay.
If you like to do that. And so, yeah, I think that was mathematics and philosophy and some artificial intelligence, if I recall,
Right.
in that first degree.
Okay. And how long ago was that? AI, because AI's been around for a long time. So when was that first degree done with AI?
Well, I mean, that's like, it's got to be in the, I mean, it was, I guess, in the early 90s. I mean, this is a long time. This was the pre-internet era, or at least before I started using the internet.
Okay.
So back then it was possible to be interested in a topic and not know anybody else who was interested in the topic. So for me, I had long been fascinated with these, I don't know, big picture questions about like humanity's future and whether the human condition could somehow be fundamentally transformed for better or for worse with technological advances. But I knew nobody else who was in the least bit interested in this back when I was an undergraduate in Sweden. It is like now, obviously, you just Google it and you'd immediately find news groups and YouTube channels and all the rest of it, right? But so it was a different era in that respect.
What I loved what you just told me was that the fact that you could actually build your own degree. the thing I like about that is quite often we're shoehorned to doing degrees that aren't quite in your curiosity, or there's no compelling thing for you that you are curious about. And for me, instead of a box, you've been given like a smorgasbord, which is, I think, a great way to approach education. Maybe because I actually taught at private schools, high school, for a few years before I moved into technology. So the education system's sort of a subtopic of my interests, and I am curious about its evolution as well. So, but that's another topic.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I'm gonna resist because, like, yeah, I enjoyed university, but I didn't like school prior to that, and so being sort of liberated to study at my own pace what I wanted, like at university, was a big change for me. But yeah, well,
We'll park
let's
that.
resist the temptation. Yeah.
We won't go down that rabbit hole because that's another topic on its own. It is a philosophical one as well. But so then, when did you move after your initial degree? You've done multiple degrees in PhDs, is that correct?
Well, only one PhD, but
Right.
yeah, I did study widely at that point. In fact, I mean, because I had loathed school, I didn't read or was really not interested in science and learning and literature as a child. And it only was at age 15 that I discovered the world of learning. And then I felt I had wasted the first 15 years of my life. So I became then very intensely focused on a program of self-study.
Right.
And so, yeah, I did then kind of pursue a wide variety of different topics, but both within the university later, but also on my own in parallel.
Yeah. I totally get following your own topics. For me, I read about 60 to 70 books a year, and I just follow my curiosity. And I find that, and it just takes me to places like your book would have been discovered through curiosity. So, and there's two words that I rather like that I discovered recently that I've sort of joined together. One is, what are you curious about? And then what compels you out of this kaleidoscope of curiosities that we as humans quite often have. So that almost leads to a calling, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's I mean, I think curiosity is a wonderful thing, and sometimes you need to interleave it with periods of more focused work to actually sort of deliver stuff. But I think switching between sort of a phase where you're more putting on the blinkers and getting stuff down, and then when it's done, you ideally take them off and kind of explore.
Yes.
So I'm hoping to enter that second phase now, having finished the book, which required a kind of sustained period of trying not to get interested in too many other things.
Right. So just a quick aside here. What is the reason for the seclusion? Is it for doing some writing and thinking?
Yeah, for getting some work done and ideally some thinking as well.
Okay. Well, I'm very grateful that you've actually taken a little bit of time out from seclusion to talk to the world. This is great. I'm really, really thankful for that. Okay, so when did you start leaning into, like, you've done physics, you've studied economics, I think, you've done, and now AI. So where did AI arise? Initially, it rose at university. So when did it really start to take on some?
Actually, before that, I remember when I was in the I don't know, the Army conscription center. Back then, that was conscription in every I guess 17-year-old had to go into some center, and
it was 2 years, wasn't it?
No, well, you didn't have. I mean, so you had to go to this center, and they did a whole battery of physical and psychological tests and stuff, and then. But I remember, like, there while I was waiting to step on the exercise bike or whatever it was, reading this parallel distributed processing. I obtained this book on interlibrary loan, which was very early work on neural networks.
Yes.
And finding that very fascinating, and thinking that seemed to be on the path towards understanding the nature of human cognition and building artificial cognitive systems ultimately.
Right.
So already at that point, I guess I had this general sense that AI, the mechanization of cognition, would be not just another cool technology, but much more profound
Yes.
in the ultimate reckoning, the final invention that we will ever need to make. Because once you have machine brains that can do the invention activity better than we can, then obviously they would then be carrying forward the scientific and technological enterprise at digital speeds.
Yes.
And the human brain would become obsolete as an instrument for further development.
Yes. So it happened. So it happened even before university, you were saying?
Yeah. As a sort of, I think I was 15 or something when I first became interested in these things.
Okay.
So it's been at the back of my mind, and I guess it guided some of my studies at university as well. More broadly, I felt I wasn't sure about what the meaning of life was or what I wanted to do with my life at that point. And so I figured a good interim goal would be to try to put myself in a better position to answer that. And so studying various topics that seem potentially relevant, like philosophy deals with fundamental questions, physics deals with fundamental questions, like psychology and neuroscience.
Yes.
It's pretty, so it's kind of trying to pick up different ideas and insights from a bunch of different areas would seem good preparation for like if you don't know what you should do, like in the interim, you could try to like get yourself better at figuring out the answer to that question.
Yes.
So although it was like maybe kind of seemingly random and motley assortment of topics to study, I think they were actually had a common denominator in that I felt no one discipline had a monopoly on important insights, and so I was kind of looking around for where I might gain some useful concepts.
Yeah. Well, I think that interests me is that a lot of philosophers, quite a lot, well, a lot of physicists become philosophers in their own right because they're looking at, the universe, the world, and where man fits in it and how it all works. And sometimes it's done in a mechanical way, but then the bigger questions arise out of that as well as. So some of the best quotes you'll find on philosophy come from physicists and scientists.
Yeah, I've never. To me, this hard separation that is sometimes made between philosophy and science has always seemed more of an obstacle than, like, at least my interest. I've kind of been pursuing them wherever they lead, as whether it's called philosophy or physics or something else. I don't really care so much about the labels, but just kind of chasing after the prey wherever it runs. Maybe that's a brutal metaphor, but you know what I mean. You're chasing the question rather than sort of what many do is they train in a particular academic discipline and they learn the methods of that discipline, and then they apply those methods to the questions that you're supposed to ask in that discipline. And that's a valid thing for people to do. Some people should specialize in that way, but I think there is, in addition to that, also room in the world for some people who kind of roam a little bit more.
Yeah.
And there are certain questions that you can't really tackle if you confine yourself to a specific methodology. You have to kind of grab whatever ideas and tools and concepts you can to try to make get any traction at all.
Yes. Yeah. Well, it's I think sometimes having a PhD, following the actual tools that would rise within that and the structures and approaches leads to a certain myopia, doesn't it?
Yeah, that's like the deformation professional, like where you become so you internalize the norms and expectations of your chosen profession because you spend all your day doing that and talking to other people who do that, and then your whole outlook on the world is kind of filtered through the particular concepts in that discipline. But I mean, we're all like, yeah, we all have different deformations of our past, I guess. But
Mm.
um, you can, I I guess it's also a question of psychology. So some people find it uncomfortable to be uncertain about things and the
Yes.
unfamiliar. And other people, I mean, you mentioned curiosity before, are drawn to it. Like I sometimes find the less I know about some topic, the more fun I have learning about it often.
Hmm.
Then if it's a topic I know very well, then it feels more like work, as it were. Whereas if it's like some completely random different thing I've never have any clue about, then just learning the basics of that to me feels quite relaxing and spontaneous and fun.
Yes. Now, I think that raises the quote, I don't know who it's attributed to, but if you love what you do, you'll never work another day in your life.
Yeah, yeah. I think that's like I guess the ideal to hope for if one can find a little slot in the world that allows one to do that. That is unfortunately a fairly rare privilege because it can be hard to love what you do if what you do is um, something that is maybe like strenuous or boring or ungratifying. There are a lot of jobs that have
Yeah.
to be done, but they are not being done because they're fun, but they
Yes.
have to,
Yes.
and that's valuable too. But
Yeah. Yeah, it is, and there's no escaping that. But I think um, that pursuing that, having that intent to try and discover that is it's not a bad life journey as far as I'm concerned. So, do you feel like what you do is almost play, Nick?
um, yeah, well, the distinction between play and work is also one of these dichotomies that I have that doesn't seem to match very well to my own personal experience. It differently blurs. Like I sometimes have like if I were to keep some time log on like so how many hours did you work today? I have no idea really because it's like what I do for fun. A lot of that indirectly informs
Yeah.
my work, and a lot of the work is also fun, and so
Yeah.
yeah, I think that those categories even are is not like a very useful descriptor, I think.
Yeah. They're
For me.
entangled, aren't they?
Yeah, very much overlapping.
Yes. So when did AI is obviously a big focus of yours because they're the two books that have been I know Superintelligence was a New York Times bestseller and I enjoyed it. It's very philosophical, which I rather liked because I think we need to um, ask better questions and explore uncertainty. And I think there's a lot of people that are not comfortable with uncertainty. They give me a template, give me steps, give me, and then I can become successful, whether it's a philosopher or a teacher or an entrepreneur. So let's lean a little bit more into AI now. So when did AI really become a bigger focus for you? When did that really happen?
Yeah, I mean, throughout, really, like I wasn't maybe, I mean, obviously not writing much about it as a kind of undergraduate student, but it has seemed for a long time like a central issue for the future of humanity.
Yep.
And I was like back in the 90s, I think, as like so doing a master's degree at the time. I think I wrote this sort of manifesto of predictions from philosophy is like kind of
Uh,
arguing, I mean, basically what I said earlier, that we shouldn't make this very hard boundary between philosophy and science, and that
yes.
like even like philosophical concepts can be useful, particularly in the pre-paradigmatic phase where you're tackling questions for which there is not as yet a clear methodology, where maybe it's not even obvious exactly what the right way to ask the question is. Then, these more conceptual skills that philosophers sometimes develop could be useful, but particularly if combined with some other knowledge and insight from other disciplines. And that you can get, if somebody understands two fields. They sometimes can do things that you couldn't do by, say, combining one person who understands one field and one person who understands the other field. And then you sit them at the same desk and hope that some great collaboration will happen. Well, it can happen, but often those kinds of sort of forced interdisciplinary collaborations are very superficial. But having people with at least some degree of basic understanding of a wider range of questions can be quite fruitful. And this later in the Future of Humanity Institute that I set up at Oxford, this, I guess, fast forwards some years, but we had a lot of these polymath types there. And I think it just felt natural to be curious and to sort of learn whatever you needed from different areas to be able to pursue the questions we were interested in. And I think that did create a very fruitful intellectual culture.
Yeah.
At FHI.
Yeah, I think, maybe one way to describe it is hard science and soft science. So philosophy versus, chemistry, for example, or physicists. These are sort of like, there's data about that, but it's very hard to get data about the human mind, isn't it, to actually be hard and fast on it, because we still don't know how the human mind really works.
Yeah, I mean, we know a lot about it, but there's also a lot we don't know about it.
Yes.
In some sense, there's nothing we know better than the human mind, in the sense that we have like spent our whole lives inhabiting it and seeing from the inside how it operates. But like matching that up to observations made in a neuroscience lab or something, that's still I do think that with the current advances in AI, that does create an additional lens through which to look at human psychology and human cognition. Yeah. These neural networks that we're now building, although they are very simplified versions of biological neurons, you still see some of the same phenomena that we can observe when humans are thinking in these big neural networks. I mean, like to an almost ridiculous degree in some cases, where these like chatbots, sometimes you have to kind of give them encouragement in the prompt, or trying to really like give them almost like a pep talk, and that sometimes that increases their performance on a particular task. They seem to try harder, which is like totally not what you would have expected in the days of good old-fashioned AI, right? Like,
yeah.
But the anthropomorphism of some of these approaches is quite striking. And so, yeah, it could just be a coincidence but I think there is probably some deeper shared structures between the way that the human brain works and how these large transformer model works. Yep. Obviously, there are still elements to the way that our cognition is organized that are not yet implemented, but the way that they generalize, the way that they develop intuitions and see patterns from data, and I think that does probably match at the sort of basic principles levels some of the things that are going on inside our own brains.
You could almost describe, well, for me, just thinking about as we've been talking here, is AI is almost the bridge between machines and humanity that's going to help us make sense of being human, I think, because it raises big questions. Don't you think? Is that?
Yeah, it certainly raises big questions. Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest question it raises probably is on the practical impact of AI as we develop increasingly powerful machine intelligences. How can we make sure to align them and make them safe? Yeah. And that was obviously a big focus of the previous book, Superintelligence.
Yep.
And then assuming we can do that, or I guess kind of entangled with that, is the questions of governance. If we can control these tools, how do we make sure we don't use them as we do with so many other technologies to wage war against each other or oppress one another, et cetera, et cetera. So then beyond that, we have questions of ethics, as has received less attention so far. But for example, some of these digital minds, I think, will be candidates for having moral status, so that they're not mere tools, but beings in their own right that might have morally considerable interest. Yeah. And getting that right is another big question. But then you're right. On top of these more practical questions, there is also the question of whether it changes how we see ourselves, or like how we conceive of our role in the world.
Yes.
Which is also interesting, I think. And yeah, and I guess that gets us closer to the topic of this deep utopia book, which considers what would happen if AI goes right, if we do solve these other practical problems, which is a big if, but let's postulate that for the sake of argument. And then if everything goes well and we develop these machine superintelligences that can do all tasks better than we can do, and we solve the world to the extent that it can be solved, right? Then what at that point would give purpose and meaning to our human lives? Like what would we be doing all day long? I think there are kind of very, like, there are superficial answers to that, but once you start to like really dig into this gets to some quite deep philosophical questions.
Yes.
Which yeah, I try to explore.
Yeah, you're in page, I'm almost through your second book after reading Superintelligence, and I suppose you're just trying to distill the two books and your journey and your thinking about and philosophizing about AI and humans and how that impacts us as humans. What will bring us meaning and purpose if, AI can actually produce great works of art and music. Okay, so a lot of artists get great meaning and writers get great meaning out of crafting words and putting them together. So if the machine can do it, you're going, well, what am I here for? Right. So, but your two books are interesting in the sense that the first one is a little bit dystopian, and then the second one is more utopian, or deep utopia, obviously. And that's maybe simplifying things. But in the first book, quickly to set things up, is you talked about the Singleton versus the multipolar, I think is the two words you used. In other words, Singleton, as I understood it, is one entity controlling AI for the world. The other one, where you have multiple entities fighting for domination. It's a race to the bottom. So that I found quite interesting, in that where's that going to go to? And you wrote this in 2014. So what are your thoughts on those, basically multipolar versus Singleton in 2024?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually wrote it in the years preceding 2014. It took like, I think, super 6 years anywhere. Yeah. So these are sort of two abstract properties of a world order, where Singleton, as you say, means a world order in which at the highest level of decision making there is a kind of one point of agency. So in theory, that could be, a world government or a world dictator, or it could be like an AI that has taken over everything, or like maybe a moral code that is strongly self-enforcing and sufficiently prevalent. So it's kind of neutral as to, whether you have a good singleton or a bad singleton or the precise form. But at an abstract game theoretic level, it means that there are certain global coordination problems that can be solved in a world where you have a singleton. Yes. And the opposite of that would be multipolar. If there's more than one decision-making entity at the highest level with different goals and objectives, and then you can get these, you can get conflict and war and competition, and each of these have their own ways of going wrong, potentially. We are familiar at the global level with the failure modes of a multipolar world, where throughout human history we've had arms races and wars and destruction of the global, like the public commons, like overfishing in the oceans or pollution, greenhouse gases, etc. We don't have experience with a global singleton. We have not yet had a world that has been integrated at that level. But it's very easy to imagine how that could go wrong. If there's like one decision-making node and that gets captured by some malevolent actor, yes, then there is nothing else that you could take refuge into, or that could overthrow it. So and so I think both of these potentially are still on the table with respect to our future. my guess is that the AI transition might increase the probability of us ending up with a kind of singleton, but it's by no means a given.
Yeah, it's interesting watching things unfold. I've been in technology and seen trends since the mid-1980s, in the rise of the PC revolution, the rise of the web and the internet in the mid-90s, the rise of social media in the early 2000s. And it's interesting to see the evolution of those technologies. What's excited me about AI and my real curiosity and being compelled now to write about it more and explore it and think about it more is the intersection of AI and humanity, because in 2022, end of 2022, which is only basically 18 months ago, AI got given a human face with a small search box, and that was ChatGPT. And the velocity of the uptake of that technology I found amazing. 100 million people signed up to that in about 7 weeks. So had you envisioned AI being accepted and embraced by humanity, the general population, so quickly? Did you envision that or not?
I mean, the speed of development at a certain point, yeah, I do discuss in Superintelligence, consider different possible scenario classes where either, if you kind of, especially if you sort of, there are two different questions about timeline you could ask at least, right? So there's like, how far are we now from fully human level general intelligence that can do everything that we can do. And then a second question you could ask is, if and when we ever reach that point, how far will that be from some radical forms of superintelligence that just completely outpaces us in all complex cognitive fields?
Yes.
And so that second question, like at least at the time, sometimes referred to as like the takeoff. Like if you have a slow takeoff, maybe that going from roughly human level to radical superintelligence, it would take decades, in a slow scenario. I thought that was less likely, and I still think that is less likely. And more likely you would have either a fast or an intermediate takeoff. So like a fast thing could be anything from like hours to weeks or a few months maybe. An intermediate might be some months to a few years. And I think we are most likely going to have something like that. It was not very obvious back in 2014 to what extent you would get very significantly world-changing products coming out from AI prior to the takeoff beginning, as it were. Like you could imagine a scenario where you had AIs that were not really very useful for anything at all, and then some lab stumbles on a key insight and they develop something internally that becomes superintelligence. But during this period, there might not be much impact on the world. That would be one scenario. Now, it looks more like we are in a scenario where you have important applications of AI even before we have fully generally intelligent AI systems. So with these LLMs that we see today, and unless we get an intelligence explosion within the next few years, I imagine we will have more of these sort of pre-AGI impacts on the world that can have an influence over ultimate outcomes. In particular, it makes it more salient to people that AI is coming. And so you see now over the last couple of years, policymakers waking up to this. And I was just in Brussels yesterday, and there was a big conference there. We've seen statements from the White House, and the UK had this global AI summit some months back. And this is a big difference from 2014, where even talking about like AGI was viewed generally as kind of science fiction, futurism, like a fringy thing. It wasn't really taken seriously by most people. But now, of course, everybody sees that this is an important topic.
Yeah.
And I think that is mainly due to the fact that we have seen impressive AI systems already, and people start to have experience interacting with chatbots, etc. and then we'll see more of that over the coming years.
Yes. Yeah, it's that leads me to the next part, which is, let's talk more about your Deep Utopia book, which is your latest release, which I've read 350 pages of. There's 500 pages there. It's a great read, poses many questions, and also provides possible scenarios. So I was looking for themes within this, basically you raise a lot of things. So there's a lot of things going on in the book, which I think,
a lot of things, yeah.
Yeah, there is. Because I've detected, tell me if I'm right or wrong, but you not only have a very strategic mind, but also you love an attention to detail as well. Is that correct?
Yeah. Unfortunately, perhaps because it does make writing something like this a much longer and harder process than if you just slap something together to.
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. And I detected that. I think you admitted in one of your books that you had this thing that controlled you quite often, which was a real attention to detail and trying to get to the real nitty-gritty of things, which raises some really great questions. So in Deep Utopia, there's a few themes that I want to look at a little bit more. You talk about redundancy. In other words, computers or AI makes us as humans redundant. And then that raises the next part, which is about, well, why am I human? Why am I here? Okay, I'm sorry about that, but I'll tell you what that is. We've had an earthquake in New York.
Really?
It's an emergency alert. 4.7 earthquake in New York.
Oh,
We've shut down JFK.
Wow. 4.7. Okay. I mean, that's hopefully you guys should be all right.
We should be
It's
okay.
a little bit like they had snow. So that was in Britain, like it's not like generally a very cold, but there was this classic phrase, the wrong kind of snow. Have you heard of that?
Is it wet snow?
It was like the rail system was crap. And then at one point they get like 1 day of snow a year. So there was like a little bit of snow, like a few centimeters, I don't know. And then the railways shut down and they say, how can you not deal with snow like this? You should expect there to occasionally be snow. And then they like had this lame excuse. Well, it was the wrong kind of snow. We had prepared, but so like, and it's a big contrast because I spent a lot of time in Canada as well, and there they can get like feet of snow, and everybody just goes on with life and don't bat an eyelid. And then there's like a couple of centimeters of snow, and the whole country just shuts down. Kids stay home from school; they can't walk to school if there is like a couple of centimeters of snow. But anyway, yeah.
Anyway,
but I'm sure 4.7 is. I guess for people who live in actual sort of earthquake-prone zones, they might have a similar attitude to 4.7.
Well, you've never had an interview interrupted by an earthquake zone warning, have you?
No, I think that's a first.
Yeah, well, just talk quickly about a little aside to snow. Seeing my ex-wife is Swedish and you're Swedish, I've actually know a little bit about Sweden in that in Sweden, at a certain time of year, you've got to put snow tires on, whereas in the USA, you don't do that. You're not allowed to do that because that's infringement of liberty and freedom. Because you have to put snow tires on, which means that if it's ice and you're still driving okay, and a bit of snow happens, you're actually okay.
Yeah. I don't. It seems to work in both countries. Like, I mean, people still manage to get on with things, which makes you wonder how many things we just assume are necessary. And then if there were only one country, I might like imagine how many things they would convince themselves were necessary and the only possible right way of doing things. If there were not other places you could look at to sort of see, you could actually do it like that.
And that comes down to Singleton and Multipolar, doesn't it, really?
Yeah, it does come down to that. So if there were a Singleton, like this is indeed one of the concerns with that kind of world order, that you would have one orthodoxy and then they would define some overturned window of acceptable opinion and like acceptable way of doing things. And there would be no counterexample. So like I think a lot of political progress around the world and like revolutions and stuff have happened because people under a despot could see that there were other people who didn't have to live under a despot, and they could draw inspiration from that and say, well, hey, if they can have a democracy, why can't we have a democracy? Or if they can have, public healthcare, why can't we have public healthcare?
Yes.
Or if being able to learn from people who do things differently, I think, has been an important driver of progress.
Yes. And yep, exactly. And being able to travel opens our eyes to that sort of world and shows us different options that we wouldn't have thought about by hiding in our own country, which is great. So I want to get back to where we were rudely erupted by an earthquake alert in New York. Redundancy and the questions that come out of redundancy. In other words, you talk about, I think, light and deep redundancy, or I might be using the wrong terms, but the thing is, AI could make us as humans redundant. Tell us a little bit about your thinking on redundancy.
Well, yeah, deep or shallow. So, I mean, so there are layers to this, and it's like a kind of a journey that you can take to start to think about these. So at the most superficial level, you have the consideration that if AIs become better, they could do more of our jobs. So then maybe you would have unemployment. And then there is a question of what could you do about that? Like you could have maybe re-educate people to do the jobs that AIs can't do, maybe unemployment insurance. There's like a set of questions there, right? The next sort of level, you realize that, well, ultimately it's not just some jobs that could be automated, but with certain exceptions, all. Like if AIs, it's not just that they could do the assembly on factories, but they could also ultimately, write the poetry and direct the movies and compose the music, etc., etc. And like the main exception to that would be in cases where consumers have a direct preference that the work be done by hand. Man-made or human-made goods might command a premium price, just as today some consumers might pay a premium for a trinket that is made by some favored group, or some indigenous craft people make it versus it's being done by a sweatshop in Indonesia. Maybe you pay more for the handmade product because you care not just about the product but about its causal origin. And so to the extent that future consumers do that might create demand for human labor. Or we prefer to maybe watch human athletes compete, even if the robots could run faster or box harder. Like it might just be more fun. Yes. So, but if we bracket that for the time being, then yeah, you could have kind of full unemployment. So that's a slightly more radical conception. You have a kind of post-work utopia, if you try to think of some good way that things could be in that condition. But then, and that's usually where the conversation stops, if it even gets to that point. But I think there are several steps beyond that you could consider, which is you could have a more generally post-instrumental condition, where it's not just human economic labor that has been automated, but a lot of other things that we spend effort on as well at this condition of technological maturity, which I think would follow the invention of machine superintelligence. And so if you think about so if you didn't have to work, what would you do instead? Well, some people would say, well, it is great. Or I like fitness, or maybe I would spend more time, working out or something. But then you think, well, in a technologically mature world, you would be able to pop a pill that would have the same physiological effects as spending an hour on the cross trainer or with the weights. And so then would there still be any point in going to the gym if you like? And so then you think, well, I really I'd like to understand mathematics better. So now maybe I wouldn't have time to actually learn. I never really got to do this in school. So but then again, at technological maturity, I think there would be affordances to directly instill new skills and knowledge in the brain. And you could imagine different either sort of nanobots infiltrating the human cortex and adjusting the synaptic weights into whatever configuration constitutes knowledge and mathematical skill. Or if we are uploaded into computers, then it would be even easier to sort of directly edit our parameters. And so you can then go through almost like a case study, the different types of activity that currently fill our lives and see whether, in fact, there wouldn't, at technological maturity, be some shortcut to achieving the same outcome that we're seeking. And I think in a good many cases, in a big majority of them, yeah, there would be shortcuts that would then at least put a little question mark above those activities. Like you could still do them, but it would sort of risk seeming pointless if you had to put in this effort only to get to a point that you could have gotten equally easy by just pressing a button.
Yes.
So that then creates this more profound challenge of conceiving of a post-instrumental utopia. I think there is like one step beyond that as well, which is what I call a plastic utopia, which is where we don't just have the ability to automate all the things that we put effort into, but where we ourselves also become malleable. So with these technological affordances, we could also modify our own psychology, our own experiences, our own bodies. And in the limit, we'd just be able to choose what we feel and think and our natures. And that would then put question marks over an even wider range of activities. I mean, if for example, we do a bunch of stuff now because it's fun, like maybe you climb the mountain, it's strenuous and your feet hurt, but in the end you get this satisfaction of looking, at all the way to the horizon, and you feel a sense of accomplishment. But if you're doing the whole, only to get this jolt of joy at the end, I mean, you could get that jolt of joy at technological maturity, with a drug or some direct brain stimulation without the side effects and addiction. So you really then end up in this space where there's a lot of stuff we could do, but also at the same time, at least prima facie, it looks like we'd have no particular reason to do any of those. And so what then? I mean, do we just become kind of contented pleasure blobs, like enjoying drug ecstasies or direct brain stimulation of the nucleus accumbens? Or is there something more other values that we nevertheless would have reason and ability to instantiate in such a kind of plastic world? And so that then gets to kind of, where the book really starts. I mean, it does have a couple of chapters on the more mundane questions leading up to that, but that's kind of at the heart of the investigation.
Yeah, I love the setup in terms of the redundancy, and then that raises the bigger questions of, if the machine's doing it all, can it add to, like you talked about, plastic AI? So the reality there is that a machine could produce the joy, that the endorphins that we get from doing running, for example, could be done via AI, for example, and the technology. Now, what it leads to redundancy, it raises the bigger questions for us as humans, which is purpose and meaning. And I'm going to read a quote it's a quote I know about and I've been fascinated by, it's by Joseph Campbell. He said, "Follow your bliss. That's where you'll discover purpose and meaning." In other words, don't worry about what or why purpose or bliss or purpose or meaning is, because just following your bliss will produce happiness, fulfillment. And the other key word that you discuss a lot is fulfillment in your book, Deep Utopia, which is great. In other words, you don't need to actually be able to define what or why meaning or purpose is. Just by following your bliss, Joseph Campbell said, is really enough, because that's where you'll discover real deep joy and meaning, just in that journey of following your bliss, which is an inclination to do things you're good at. So let's talk a little bit more about fulfillment, meaning, and purpose, which comes out of what the question of, I've been replaced by AI, what next? Who am I? And for example, that's the question in an author, a writer goes, ChatGPT can do this for me. Why do I actually need what I'm here for? Let's discuss purpose and meaning and fulfillment, because they're big questions, aren't they?
Yeah, so I mean, maybe some people are led to their meaning if they follow their bliss. I mean, other people are led to fentanyl. The it might depend a lot on the circumstances you're in and what you try first. And it is indeed a deep, not so easy question whether ultimately we have most reason to reject a purely hedonic conception of utopia. I mean, it's easy to dismiss it because it seems kind of uninspiring, but the question is not which utopia is most interesting to look at, but which one is best to inhabit. And these are two distinct questions, and we have to be very careful to separate those in our minds if we're trying to give answers. Now, I think ultimately it's plausible that we can and should instantiate other values in addition to hedonic well-being in utopia. We certainly could have that as well, and should have huge amounts of it. But it doesn't have to exclude the future also being interesting and fulfilling and enchanting and even purposeful. You can distinguish two different kinds of purpose. It is like kind of natural and artificial purposes in utopia. So artificial purposes are just purposes we give ourselves for the sake of having purpose. So we kind of do this, you play a game, like you decide that you're going to try to get your piece to a certain square on the board or something like that, right? It's a completely made up purpose, but it can still be a good thing to do that. You adopt this goal, and then once you have that goal, it creates opportunity for an activity, which today maybe gives us joy, but you might also think it's intrinsically valuable to be involved in these kinds of activities in ways that draw on your different faculties and your creativity, and you have to struggle for it. So certainly we could have kind of unlimited artificial purposes in utopia. If you have a problem just setting yourself a goal and being motivated by it, certainly neurotechnologies would be at your disposal to sort of install different goals in your mind, if that helps. So that's like a check in that box. Like artificial purpose, sure, the utopians can at least have that. But I think on top of that, they might also be able to have some forms of natural purpose. So these would be purposes that kind of exist independently of our desire to have purpose. And we have a lot of those today, right? You have to get into work if you're going to have a paycheck, which you need to pay the mortgage, and you have to brush your teeth in order to have healthy teeth. We have a lot of instrumental reasons for doing something that gives us purposes in life. And there might be some of those natural purposes surviving into utopia. Even though machines could automate a lot of the things we do, there might be some values that give us reasons for doing things that we can't outsource. For example, the value of honoring your ancestors. It maybe requires the honoring to be done by you, for you to spend time thinking about, your parents or other people who have lived before you and remembering them and so on. Continuing traditions. You might value tradition, and for the tradition to continue, it might not count if you just create some machines that enact the rituals or something. Like it might have to be done by the people who started the tradition or their sort of descendants, depending on what the tradition is. There could be more subtle aesthetic values that require our direct participation for them to be realized. And there are social entanglements that we have. Like if somebody else happens to, for whatever reason, want you to do a certain thing, then even though you could create a robot that would do it, that might just not be what they want. So if you happen to care about what the other person wants, and that's what they want, then you now have a natural purpose. The only way for you to achieve your goal of satisfying their preferences by actually doing the thing. And I think there are more complex and subtle versions in which there are these value-based constraints that might impel us to do things and give us some natural purposes as well. So that's the outlook for purpose. Now I make a distinction between purpose and meaning, where purpose is the kind of narrower term, which basically means doing something for the sake of achieving something else. And meaning is, maybe that involves purpose, but it's like a special kind of purpose, or some, it has some extra attributes, and which I also discuss. But there the situation is more complicated.
Yes, and you talked about like levels of purpose. You've got one, like any used examples. For example, the reason you clean your teeth or go to work is to earn a paycheck, and then there's big purposes which are much harder to define. I did love the analogy about golf, and you in talking about you don't understand why people enjoy golf. I think that's what you said, but and the example
I
was
don't.
that. What'd you say?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, so golf was about, so like people go and play golf, well, I actually play golf and I feel better if I actually hit the ball in the hole in par instead of a bogey or a double bogey. On the other hand, there's a certain just joy in having a conversation with your playing partner and enjoying nature. So there's different layers to purpose, isn't there, really?
Yeah. I think I expressed any puzzlement why people enjoy golf. I think all of the things you mentioned, and it's example of a game, right, where we kind of create artificial scarcity and limitations in order then to enable an activity that we enjoy. I think probably with respect to golf, it's a lot about enjoyment.
Yes.
But that is not a sufficient goal to create natural purposes in utopia, since that would be shortcuts to enjoyment.
Yes.
Although there too, the analysis becomes more complex, because you could imagine having certain values that would not want you to modify yourself. If you have those values, then the only way you might be able to get the enjoyment, if somehow you have another value that prevents you from availing yourself of drugs or other shortcuts, then you might be stuck with having to try to generate little dribbles of pleasure by running around like a madman with a club and swinging it at little balls or whatever tickles your jollies in perpetuity. I mean, I think it's not an either or thing there. I think we could certainly upregulate our ability to take pleasure in things, but it doesn't need to be all the way to the other extreme, where you have some kind of junkie sprayled over a flea-infested mattress still in bliss. Like, you could have a combination of great levels of subjective enjoyment and also engaging in beautiful works of creation, in interactions with other people, exercising your different faculties to the maximum, being creative, etc., etc. And there's like an interesting question: to what extent can you combine these different plausible values so that they can be co-instantiated?
Yes.
To a very, very high degree. And that's the bit that I'm kind of optimistic about, that that there is something there that could be created that would be wonderful. In fact, I think wonderful beyond our ability to imagine currently. But it's not a book that tries to. It's not so much a book about conclusions as it is one about questions, and trying to enable the reader to bring into focus some of these deep questions and then decide for themselves. So it's a book that kind of plays with different perspectives and ideas and flashes them together. And I think some people, especially if they've only heard something about the book or like read a little extract, I might not realize that some of these early things that are unappealing are kind of intentionally presented to be unappealing, but nevertheless, the idea is to run into that counterintuitiveness and collide it with other counterintuitivenesses and then see what kind of emerges from that, rather than try to paper over the sort of philosophical inconveniences. Let's rip the wallpaper off and see what's actually there.
So what you're asking in this book is to challenge people to live a considered life, which is where you ask the questions.
Yeah, or at least to think about these things.
Yeah.
And ultimately the hope is that if at some point some group of people are tasked with deliberating about the future, which might happen if AI goes well, whether it's a few people in some AI lab or some government or the voters of some country, or maybe some humanity-wide process whereby ultimately at some point somebody needs to have some opinion about what kind of future ultimately we want to steer towards.
Mhm.
Then that would be a very hard deliberation, right? Like imagine trying to somehow conceive of this, the millions of years into the future. So I figured it could be useful for those to have something to read in preparation for going into those deliberations that could,
Mhm.
help them think about these questions and maybe put them in the right frame of mind, a kind of playful, generous frame of mind
Yes.
as they approach this. And so that's the kind of little secret purpose behind the book.
Yeah. I think that's fantastic. And for me, it raises a whole lot. It's a little bit like you're trying to provide a forecast or different scenarios, I suppose, which is not answers. And the scenarios pose questions, which I think we need to consider. But one of the questions I ask is, will AI enhance and amplify human creativity or suppress it? I'm interested in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, how do we measure human creativity?
Yes.
I certainly
Well,
think, like in the near term, there are a lot of cool creative stuff that people will be able to use AI tools to do. I mean, from like image generation, music. I just heard somebody who'd use some AI music generation stuff to make some kind of quite funky. So creative people will use this. Now, ultimately, I think all the things we do with our creativity will be doable by AI without reliance on human creative co-input. We saw this with chess, where that was first humans were just better than chess computers, right? And then chess computers became better than humans. But for a period of time, the very best performance would be if you combined a chess computer with a human grandmaster, and together they could beat any other human or any other chess computer. But after I think about 10 years or so, the chess computers just became so much better that it doesn't really help to have a human playing alongside it. It's just better to leave all the decisions to the chess computer.
yeah.
And I think that same will hold with respect to AGI. That for a period of time, you get the best performance by kind of drawing on the strengths of the human and the strengths of the AI. And they have slightly different strengths. But ultimately, the AI will just surpass us across the board.
Yeah.
And then we'll have to base our sense of purpose and meaning and worth on something other than us being able to make some practically useful contribution.
Yeah. Well,
Um,
I think purpose and meaning come out of, for me, if you try and put a destination on it, I'll be happy when, rather than I am happy now doing something that I seem to have skills and experience and love doing, which is follow your bliss type scenario. Um, so it, for me, the question is what I'm trying to find the answer myself is what brings me deep joy. And I do know some of those. Number one, having human conversations, like bumping into someone in a restaurant like in New York. We've had quite a few of those. And you know what? They're better than the goal of visiting the Empire State, for example. For me, having that human conversation where are better communicators because we've got the time now, because the AI is doing the heavy lifting, where we can be better at listening, we can get to know a person, hear their stories. We've got the time. And what I'm grateful for is you giving me the time to hear your story and share it, because that brings me a lot of joy. Because I am fascinated, curious about the human condition, and will continue to be. And when you get to talk to a person, if you get context, hear their story, and for me, part of the joy too is I like running experiments with waiters and waitresses as they serve you, and you ask them their name. And quite often they'll be from South America, they'll be from Kazakhstan, like we did the other day, and they will open up because you've seen them as a human.
right.
And then
Yeah.
what you get is you hear their story because you have seen them. That's one of the things that brings me deep joy, is the art of communication as humans. And AI might release us from the drudgery so we can actually be better humans, as in the way we communicate. I don't know. What are your thoughts on communication and AI?
Yeah, I think it's striking that right now, leading edge AI are actually talking to us
Mm,
like they are language models.
mhm.
And so rather than sort of interacting with them via like a C++ console or something, right? You're actually just writing English, um, which does cast some of the issues related to AI alignment in a new light. There might be new affordances from the fact that we can formulate our goals and instructions in ordinary language. I think we will see multimodal coming online soon, and for better or worse, and probably both, really, that will start to impact how human communication systems work, I
Yes.
think.
Yep.
There are seems that seem obviously good, like automated translation and stuff like that, and like artists having the ability to create more easily, what would previously be a big budget movie production with lighting guys have to run around, and like if that were in the hands of independent film producers, I think that would be really cool. So there's a lot, like endless number of positive applications, but I think one also needs to think at a systemic level, just as social media have slightly shifted the dynamics of how our public uh, conversations go by kind of making certain types of messages proliferate more. And so you see a lot of like a lot of nastiness and hate and stuff in social media. It's like easily, it has that immediate kind of engagement factor.
Mhm.
And it like shorter form content seems to be doing well relative to when books were like the main form, so it does change indirectly also the kind of contents that get traction and get attention. And that like most likely AI tools will also keep making different changes, like maybe individualize content more to the particular user, in ways that might be kind of specifically designed and targeted to hit their trigger points. Like marketers who know precisely which words they need to say to
Yep.
Jeff Bezos to get you to be excited about the product.
Yep.
Um, Political communication, the opportunities for censorship and propaganda are enormous, obviously,
Yeah,
when you
yeah.
cannot just record what everybody's saying, but you could then actually have AIs analyze all that they are saying and create some sort of scoring system that then directly ties into targeted communication to produce some quantifiable shift in public opinion about some particular topic. Like all these tools have so many uses, but we don't have the kind of predictive social science that would enable us to say, like, if you do
Yeah.
change some of the underlying knobs on the global communication system, what kind of equilibrium ultimately results from that. So
Yeah.
we'll just have to see as this plays out and hope for the best.
Yes. Well, we are complicated creatures, and we've discovered that AI, with its large language models, has just exhibited that to another degree. So,
Yeah.
uh, Nick, it's been an absolute joy. I'm aware of your time, so you can do some more thinking and writing in beautiful Portugal. Um, are there any, just one last question. What brings you, because I don't think you almost saying we still don't know what meaning and purpose really is. We sort of just, it's a question, what is meaning, what is purpose? But what brings you joy every day? If you didn't get paid, what would you do every day?
I mean, honestly, the same as what I am doing.
Yes, I thought that would be the answer.
Yeah, 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 yeah. So that's a big privilege.
Yeah,
Let's hope we can, yeah, use this. And I guess maybe, I don't know for you whether the answer is the same. Like, would you, if you were not able to, monetize your YouTube streams or stuff, like, would you still be doing this, do you think?
absolutely. I am grateful to be able to have these conversations with these incredible people from all around the world, Nick. For me, it brings me joy. I learn so much from them. And then also what brings me joy is being able to share it from my platform.
Yeah.
And because the other thing there's basically three things I think important, and as humans for me, is I think we are all innately creative as humans. Some are more creative than others. There's different degrees in different areas. But I think, number one, I think as humans, discover what you love doing. Ask that question. It doesn't mean watch TV, of course. Discover what you love doing, create something from that. For me, that's writing, producing, media, and then sharing it with the world. I think the other thing is that to make a difference out of your own creation, I think for me, they're the three things in sequence that bring me joy.
Good. Yeah, I'm happy you're able to do that, and with good result as well, and other people can benefit from it, hopefully. So
yeah, well, it's really so. For me, I would do this without getting paid.
Yeah, let's count our blessings and be thankful. Yeah.
Well, I'm very grateful. And then you're mindful of your time. One quick question: can you sum it up? How do people prepare for AI utopia?
Step one, read Deep Utopia and
excellent.
Yeah. I mean, I think we shouldn't, like, from a practical point of view. I mean, so I think obviously I think these questions we should be thinking about more. I wouldn't have written the book, but we need to remember that we are not there yet. So there's like a whole bunch of very pressing and very practical obstacles between here and this hypothetical future. So I think getting involved in trying to nudge AI developments or other issues in the world in a positive direction, trying to spread love and positivity and then try to tackle as best you can the issues you see that are wrong. They're like, for different people that will mean different specific things. But we do have one thing that, so in most respects, the utopians would have it much better than we did. But there is one respect in which we might be in a uniquely advantageous position, which is the ability to have a practical, useful, beneficial impact on the world. Might be much bigger now. I mean, in a world where every problem is solved, there is like, you can't really contribute very much. Whereas now there are many problems that are not solved and that really need to be solved. And we, especially if we are kind of actually not that far from this AI nexus where we might have huge consequences on the far future. But even aside from that, just from a mundane perspective, there are like so many screaming necessities in the world, and we are in a position to at least do something little here or there to help out in some way. And that is something that like the utopians might not have, but that we have. And I think from many different points of views, we should avail ourselves of these opportunities to try to leave the world a little bit better than it would have been without us, if we can. So those are my admonition and encouragement to the viewers.
And that poses one last thing. There's a lot of information, but there's not enough wisdom in the world. So I think, would AI help us with more wisdom?
Well, yeah, I have to run off, but okay. yeah, I think so. Yes. Well, we just have to be above some threshold of wisdom to actually use the AI to help us become wiser.
Yes.
Like a sufficiently foolish person would deliberately hamstring the AI to not tell it the truth or to not, help them develop more. And so you might need to, like, above a certain threshold, you can sort of bootstrap yourself. You can think about your own errors and start to figure out ways to correct for them. And the question is whether collectively we are above that threshold or under that threshold as a species. I think that's an open question, but I think we're either just above it or possibly just below it. But that's like one of the key open questions, I think.
Yes.
For which the answer has not yet been written.
No.
All right. Good to talk to you.
So Nick, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. It's been an absolute blast and a joy. And I'll be in London end of the year. Maybe might be able to catch up. I'd love to meet you in person. So
do stay in touch.
I will. Great.
All right.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you very much.